The 83rd Annual World Science Fiction Convention, or WorldCon, went down in Seattle this past August. On a panel called The Shifting Landscapes of Epic Fantasy, a bunch of heavy-hitting authors came together, including Brandon Sanderson, Robin Hobb, Rebecca Roanhorse, Ryan Cahill, and George R.R. Martin, the author of the incredibly popular A Song of Ice and Fire books, adapted by HBO as Game of Thrones. The whole panel runs for over 2 hours and is well worth watching, but the moment that got the most attention comes right at the end, when a fan stands up and asks a question.
Here's the thing, George, you're not going to be around for much longer, and this is a tough question that I wanted to ask. This is more directed at Brandon. No. Wait, I was wondering, how would you feel about someone else taking over and finishing the book?
So this person is asking, in the least delicate way it is possible for someone to ask something, what will happen to A Song of Ice and Fire if George R.R. Martin dies before he finishes writing it, since he's not gonna be around much longer? Obviously, this question is beyond rude, especially if you know how Martin feels on the topic. He has not been shy over the years, saying what he thinks of people who bring this up.
Well, I find that question, pretty offensive, frankly, when people start speculating about my death and my health. So, fuck you to those people.
And that's fair. What are the 3 topics you're not supposed to bring up at dinner? It's money, religion, politics. Surely we can add, don't tell someone they're going to die soon to that list. I also love how this person tries to cover by saying,
This is more directed at Brandon.
Oh no, I'm only bringing up your death so I can ask Brandon Sanderson a question. Your death isn't about you. Call this internet brain, call it fan entitlement, call it whatever you want. Just don't do it. Having said that, I'm going to reiterate. Broaching this question directly to Martin is rude beyond redemption. I understand that there are a lot of fans who are curious about the books and what's going to happen next and where the Winds of Winter is, but at some point, curiosity collides with decorum, and decorum should win. But the truth is that a lot of fans have had some variation on this thought. Martin is in his mid-70s. He began writing A Song of Ice and Fire in the 1990s, and he's been working on the 6th book in the series, The Winds of Winter, for over 14 years. We don't know when it's going to come out. After that, he has one more book to go, A Dream of Spring. We don't know how long that book might take to write, and we don't know whether it might get split into multiple books. Martin's tales tend to grow in the telling. He originally pitched A Song of Ice and Fire as just one trilogy, and obviously that did not work out. So if you look at all that, and the thought comes to mind that Martin may not live to finish writing his series, I don't think you need to feel automatically ashamed about it. I also don't think you need to feel bad for talking about it with other fans. Song of Ice and Fire is far from the most important thing in the world, but it has sold upwards of 100 million copies, and that was back in 2020. And when a series is that successful, I think that its ending, or lack thereof, is a matter of public concern, however small. I think we should, of course, try and be delicate and respectful if we talk about this, but I do think we should be able to talk about it. It's a free country, after all. For now. Is it wrong to do what I'm doing right now, which is to talk about the possibility of Martin's death in a semi-public forum? I'd like to think I do it with enough grace and tact to stay on the right side of the line, but you can tell me if I'm correct after you watch this episode of...
Fuck you to those people.
So I'm going to take this question semi-seriously. If George R.R. Martin is unable to finish writing A Song of Ice and Fire, what happens? Is it possible, as the person in the video suggested, that another author could step in? The first name that fans usually bring up in these discussions is Brandon Sanderson, the author of Mistborn and the Stormlight Archive and a million other books. The man is a writing machine. He's a popular pick because one of Sanderson's first claims to fame was finishing the Wheel of Time series after the original author Robert Jordan died in 2007. Sanderson's star was on the rise back then, and he was already a massive fan of the Wheel of Time. He wrote a moving tribute to Jordan on his blog. Jordan's widow, Harriet McDougal, loved it. Arrangements were made, and Sanderson wrapped up the Wheel of Time series with 3 final books to much acclaim. Sanderson has been asked before whether he would consider finishing A Song of Ice and Fire, and he's always been very unwavering with his answer.
Not me.
As Sanderson wrote in a Reddit thread in 2016, I wouldn't say yes to finishing ASOIIF if asked, and I don't think that asked me. I'd respectfully decline. And the reason Sanderson would decline is that he knows he's not the right man for the job. Martin and Sanderson both write epic fantasy books, but if you've read their work, you know that they are very different kinds of writers. In that same Reddit thread, Sanderson says that he would be uncomfortable writing scenes of sex and violence, of which there are quite a few in A Song of Ice and Fire. He said that he read the first book in the series and then stopped because the Daenerys Targaryen story was too brutal. Sanderson also brings up how differently he and Martin approach the subject of magic. Sanderson is pretty famous for coming up with these complex magic systems that have very specific rules. His systems are almost less like magic and more like fake branches of physics, whereas Martin prefers his magic to be arcane and mysterious. And more than anything, Sanderson sees Martin's work as he puts it, fundamentally pessimistic. And that's just not a vibe he thinks that he can channel well. There are other reasons it wouldn't work. I haven't read a ton of Sanderson, but I have read his first Mistborn trilogy, and I liked it, but it's definitely a plot-driven kind of story. The fun for me was seeing Sanderson arrange all the characters and plot twists like dominoes, then tip them over, and you get to watch them all fall down in a neat line. On the other hand, the Song of Ice and Fire books are character-driven. They're sprawling, they're winding, they expand and contract, and go on all kinds of weird tangents and byways. Again, these are just completely different sorts of authors. Brandon Sanderson couldn't finish Martin's books, and he wouldn't do it if asked, and that is for the best. But what about a different author? Some fans have suggested that Joe Abercrombie could be a good fit, since his first law books are dark and gritty in a way that recalls A Song of Ice and Fire, and he's certainly a better choice than Sanderson, but at least right now, Martin doesn't seem to want anybody touching his story but him. To use his words, I don't see anyone else ever writing legally in that universe. Martin has always come off as someone who cares very deeply about his creations, as he told Collider earlier this year.
I think a lot of writers, these are my children, these stories that I create.
However popular these characters are, however much they belong to the world, if you want to put it like that, they belong to Martin first, and writing his books is clearly a very personal process for him. So I completely understand why he wouldn't want anyone else doing it, whatever happens. There is a tiny bit of wiggle room here. In 2016, the fantasy and sci-fi blogger Adam Whitehead recalled something that Martin allegedly once said at a convention. Lots of disclaimers here. According to Whitehead, Martin said that he would consider making a detailed outline for the rest of his story or talking to another author about finishing it if he ever found himself in the same situation as Robert Jordan did, which is to say, diagnosed with a terminal illness with a couple years of warning. But that is secondhand information from years ago. I don't know how much stock we want to put in it. In any case, Martin seems pretty hale, so it's kind of a moot point. Right now, there doesn't seem to be a future where another author takes over for Martin should the worst happen. But what about an author who isn't an author? It's 2025, and I feel like we can't avoid this topic. Could AI finish writing A Song of Ice and Fire? So there are really two questions here. The first is, would AI even be capable of writing a book, to say nothing of these books? And second, if it is capable, would it be allowed, legally speaking? People have already tried to answer the first question. In 2023, the year generative AI really took off and everyone started talking about it nonstop, a fan named Liam Swain made headlines when he had ChatGPT write its own version of The Winds of Winter. This final book, we'll call it, clocked in at 683,276 words, which is significantly longer than any book Martin has actually written in the main series. Swain eventually took the project down for reasons we'll get to later, but I looked at it back in the day, and trust me, it was an interesting experiment, but it was horribly written. The AI seemed to have only a vague grasp on plot details from earlier books. The characters were all over the place. Important players are never mentioned. And long-dead characters are suddenly alive again and headlining their own chapters. The prose was repetitive. It was dry, and it went on and on and on and on and on. At the time, I thought, okay, there's no way AI is going to threaten authors. But that was a few years ago. AI has come a long way since then, so I decided to do my own little experiment and asked a couple of large language models to draft a few chapters of The Winds of Winter for me to see if anything had changed. First, I asked ChatGPT, which did a pretty middling job. Once again, it seemed to not remember what happened in the other books, so it wrote a chapter from the perspective of Theon Greyjoy, who at the end of A Dance with Dragons, the 5th book in the series, is in Winterfell, being tortured by Ramsay Bolton, and he and Jane Poole jump from the rafters of the castle in an escape attempt. That's the last we see of them. But in the ChatGPT chapter, they're just still in Winterfell, and this time they rappel down the wall with a rope. It kind of rewrote the last chapter of A Dance with Dragons, but not as good. The chapter, it basically holds together, but it's kind of exhausting to read because the prose is so weird. In some ways, it resembles Martin's, but it's different enough that it feels uncanny and uncomfortable to me. For instance, here's a bit where ChatGPT describes a feast going on at Winterfell. Fires roared until men's faces sweated and then roared again until they froze. The serving girls moved like winter bees, stinging and gone. All was noise and hunger, fitted together with the patience of carpenters. So are the fires freezing the men's faces? If the noise and hunger are fitted together with the patience of carpenters, that means it's organized and neat, but a feast is chaotic. I can tell it's like reaching for evocative descriptions, but it just reads like nonsense strung together. Here's another weird bit that stood out to me. Ramsay liked to circle the castle as if he were measuring it for a new coat. What does that mean? I also asked Grok, the LLM that Elon Musk built for Twitter, or X, to write some chapters, and Grok overall was better with remembering details, and there are fewer bizarre attempts at flowery poetics, but the chapters themselves are much shorter. And it made some weird choices, like for instance, Grok chose to write a chapter from the point of view of Jon Snow, right after he's stabbed to death by his own Night's Watchman at the end of A Dance with Dragons. And in this AI chapter, Jon is just fine. He's injured and he's brought into his quarters and they get to work healing him. He's not dead, which I can't imagine is how the actual version is going to go. And look, while these AI chapters that I had these LLMs write are generally readable, they feel lifeless in a way that is hard to quantify. I read a few chapters of A Dance with Dragons for comparison's sake beforehand, and I had fun reading them. Like, I was laughing at the jokes, and I was compelled the whole way through. But even when these AI chapters kind of read like something Martin might write, they are a chore to get through. I just wanted these clankers to wrap it up. So I'm tempted to say, no, AI is not capable of finishing A Song of Ice and Fire. But I've got to acknowledge that these new chapters, while not great, are a lot better and more readable and more coherent than the ones that Liam Swain produced when he kind of tried this back in 2023. Those were unbearable. These are just bad. AI is getting better. It's still bad, but it's getting better. Recently, the author Mark Lawrence ran a test to see how good people are at telling AI writing apart from human writing. He prompted ChatGPT to write 4 stories of about 350 words each, and then called in 4 working fantasy authors to write 4 stories of equal length, including Robin Hobb, who was on the panel with Martin at Worldcon. Then he asked people to choose which stories were written by AI and which were written by humans, and to rate the stories on a scale of 1 to 5, 1 being bad, 5 being good. Around 3,000 people participated, and the takeaway is we are not very good at telling human writing apart from AI writing. People got it right about half the time, so a coin toss. And on balance, people liked the AI-written stories more than the human-written stories. So obviously this wasn't a scientifically rigorous test, and the stories that they're being tested on were very short. AI writing tends to get worse and fall apart the longer the sample is. Like, I have a very hard time believing anybody could read the stories the LLMs wrote for me, the ones from The Winds of Winter, and think they were actually written by George R.R. Martin. But even a couple of years ago, results like these would be nigh unthinkable. So honestly, who's to say how good AI will be at writing in 5, 10, 15 years? Let's pivot to whether AI would even be allowed to finish writing A Song of Ice and Fire, assuming it could. If Martin had his way, absolutely not. Martin is a plaintiff in a copyright infringement lawsuit filed by the Authors Guild against OpenAI, the company that makes ChatGPT. The suit alleges that ChatGPT is reliant upon systemic theft on a mass scale, which it is, so obviously he's not very keen on the technology. The suit also cites Liam Swain's AI Winds of Winter book, which is why Swain took it down. There are several suits like this currently making their way through the court system. The idea is to get courts to try and draw some lines and establish some rules about what LLMs can and can't do, because right now it's the Wild West out there. We don't have final word on any of this, but barring Martin having some public change of heart, it's pretty clear that he would prefer that no one, man or machine, work on his books. If it comes to pass that Martin is unable to finish writing A Song of Ice and Fire, the most respectful thing to do would be to simply allow the series to remain incomplete. So it's been a good long while since A Dance with Dragons came out, but I have every hope that Martin will eventually finish writing his series. You know, Martin's basically told fans time and again exactly why he's taking this long. He does work on other projects that he cares about, which he's allowed to do, but that doesn't mean he doesn't care about A Song of Ice and Fire. He seems to care a lot, so much so that he's taking years to make sure everything is perfect. And that might not be how everyone would do things in his situation, but it's an explanation that makes perfect sense to me. I accept it. But I've been a part of this community long enough to know that some fans don't see it this way. If you ever stop by certain fan sites or subreddits, you will not have trouble finding fans who seem very bitter and upset over the long wait for the Winds of Winter and beyond. And I feel like those fans are kind of torturing themselves, because at the end of the day, it's a book series, and even if it's never finished, it's just not that big a deal. In fact, there could be an upside. Let's say, hypothetically, that Martin passes on before finishing A Song of Ice and Fire. What if the series is more fascinating, richer, and interesting as an incomplete work? Bear with me a sec, because I have examples. Consider the Canterbury Tales, widely considered one of the most influential texts in the English language. The tales are unfinished. Geoffrey Chaucer died before he could write all the ones he wanted to. Or look at Kubla Khan by Samuel Taylor Coleridge, one of the most famous poems in the English language, even though it's just a fragment. As Coleridge tells it, he once got blitzed out of his mind on opium, and the poem came to him in a dream, but he only got part of it written down before he was interrupted and just kind of forgot the rest. Didn't stop it from being hugely influential.
Legendary was the Xanadu, where Kubla Khan decreed his stately pleasure dome.
My favorite example of this is a series of 4 unfinished sculptures by Michelangelo called The Prisoners, or The Slaves. They're called The Prisoners because they look like they're still trapped in these massive blocks of stone. Michelangelo never finished carving the rest of them. There's something very powerful and dynamic to me about The Prisoners. They're struggling against these stone prisons forever. They're right on the edge of possibility, and they never quite get there. And these statues would not have that effect if they were finished. They would just be impressive statues of people carved from stone, which is cool, but we have a lot of those already. Obviously, A Song of Ice and Fire is its own thing. Just because Michelangelo's Prisoners are fascinating in their incompleteness doesn't mean that Martin's books would be. But I'm trying to find a glass half full way to look at this, because isn't that more fun than wallowing in despair and anger? To wrap up, I hope Martin finishes his books, because I love them and I'd love to read more. But even if that doesn't happen, I'll still have gotten a lot out of the series, and it will still have value. So we'll keep waiting for whatever's next, and while we do, maybe chill out a bit at the cons.